Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet, the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. So, welcome, viewers, to a critical exploration of one of the most fundamental pillars of a democratic society, religious freedom. In an era where wokeness is as aggressive as ever and is reshaping conversations and narratives, we find ourselves at a crossroads questioning the impact it may have on the bedrock principle of practicing one's faith freely. So prepare yourself for a thought-provoking journey that navigates the delicate balance between societal progress and the preservation of the right to worship as we shed light on the nuances of this compelling discourse. This is not just a discussion. It's an invitation to ponder the future of religious freedom in the wake of changing cultural tides. In order to foster this discussion, with me today here is Trey Dimsdale. He's Executive Director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. With a background in law, Dimsdale has held director-level roles in prominent think tanks, including the Acton Institute, and has contributed significantly to theological literature, notably with his publication Work, Theological Foundations and Practical Implications. Welcome, Trey, to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Now, we had a lot of really interesting conversations over here in Oxford when you came to visit. I would like to just generally ask you, what drew you to working with the CRCD?
Well, like you mentioned in the introduction there, I was working at another think tank, the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. And First Liberty Institute had not that's the umbrella organization that has sponsored the CRCD. It's a nonprofit public interest law firm that's focused on doing litigation with regard to religious freedom. And as they grew and had expanded, they developed a vision for establishing a think tank and being able to do cultural and educational advocacy for liberty. And I was a good fit because I have a law degree. I don't necessarily, I'm at this point now, we do have staff members with PhDs that are actual academics, but I kind of straddle that world. I'm not truly an academic, but I can kind of speak the language of academics. I can help academics sort of become more grounded and be able to get things done. So in 2019, they hired me to come, and COVID started shortly thereafter, so that delayed the launch of the brand. There are a few things that First Liberty that was doing already that was educational focus that I inherited, and we sort of changed those things a bit. But I was hired, notwithstanding those handful of things that were already going on, and was able to sort of cast a vision for what it is that we would do. And so the name Center for Religion, Culture, Democracy sort of has like a metaphysical priority that we borrow from, most notably, probably from Tocqueville, for example. That religion provides the moral vocabulary from which, a culture gets its cohesion. And from the right types of culture, you ultimately end up having democratic institutions emerge. And so the whole focus of the CRCD's work is to make the case that religion is actually good. It's good for everybody, whether or not you actually practice a faith. Religion is something that kind of reinforces those social mores that make for social cohesion, and that if in fact religion is good, religious institutions are good, religious people are good, and religious freedom is the political conduit for allowing those ideas, people, and institutions into the public square. So in defending religion as a civic good, we are ultimately indirectly defending the democratic institutions of the West.
Okay, very good. Well, it's really interesting because some reoccurring point that we come back to in this show with from multiple angles, may it be from an angle of art or even of kind of hard science, of empirical science, or of psychology. And in the conversation that I've had is one of the points is people think that the political sphere is the political sphere, and then my private life is my private life. But it ends up what's news to them oftentimes is the understanding that, well, it's actually in the sphere of culture that the battles of our age are fought, and then they trickle into the political. But it is the culture, because the cultural life, so to speak, embraces the whole person, right? I mean, what I consume on TV, what I look at in social media, whatever I'm even doing in my free time as entertainment, that shapes me, that shapes my worldview. And as kind of art imitates nature, and we tend to imitate art. And so what we see in this kind of in the cultural surrounding, that is ultimately how we live, or it defines how we live. And that trickles into the political. So it's interesting because what you say, I mean, what I hear is that, well, if we want a renewal in the political, in the democratic, right, that we first need a cultural renewal. We need to go back to our roots. And I think that's where religion is pivotal. I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you're describing, that is sort of like the primary perception or assumptions of most people in the West today, um, representative of an idea that government is an end to itself. That there's no greater reason to have an established government other than to be self-perpetuating. And part of that is because so many Western governments are self-perpetuating, probably all of them. There's a tremendous amount of money that's spent, for the EU, for example, to promote the idea of European integration. Well, if European integration really isn't a good idea, then the EU project needs some reformation, right? But they're kind of doing their own PR work. In the United States, you have money that's spent as once like Obamacare, for example, sort of our first step towards sort of universal health care, became a reality, a part of the system. The government ended up spending quite a bit of money to sort of promote the idea, rather than for allowing sort of a continued public debate about whether or not this was sort of the best solution to a real social problem. So, what the end of government really should be is to fit around an established culture, to preserve it, to allow it to flourish, to cultivate it, in sort of maybe a passive way. It doesn't always really work out well when the government is sort of um, um, picking who wins and who loses, even sort of in the cultural realm. And so a cultural renewal is something that invites people into participating in these mediating institutions that are in between the person or even the family and the state. That these things, these cultural institutions, are the things that the government should be, the state should be attempting to preserve. And as we have people who are not investing in cultural institutions, that aren't appreciating, art or literature or those types of things that emerge from a people's metaphysical commitments, they end up pulling the levers of power as being the only means for effectuating some sort of social change. And a much more durable, a much more freedom guaranteeing way to do that is actually through cultural institutions rather than through the state.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the now working with the center, but also working with First Liberty. What's your kind of perception right now regarding religious liberty or religious freedom, specifically in the United States? I'm sure that it varies from state to state, but on an overall kind of account, what would you say? Where are we at?
So in the last few years, last 2 or 3 years, um, we've gotten some decisions from the United States Supreme Court that have been very religious freedom friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Our organization has actually litigated 4 different victories, including one decision. It's called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. That is essentially a landmark Supreme Court case on the Establishment Clause. So we're living at a time where the law is on the side of those who value religious freedom. But we're also in a time where there is decreased participation in religious institutions, not only decreased enthusiasm for religious institutions or religious expression, but increased hostility toward uh, religion and religious institutions. So the law ultimately provides a parchment barrier. If you ever heard that term from kind of the founding fathers use that term, as soon as the culture turns against religious freedom and religious persons and religious institutions, we're really in a bad state of affairs. So right now we have those two almost kind of contradictory realities. The law is on our side. Um, the U.S. Constitution explicitly protects the free exercise of religion, and bars the establishment of a state church. But then the culture is becoming more and more skeptical, and it's more difficult for religious people to practice their faith openly in some parts of the country or in some institutions or in some contexts. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of winning the culture and convincing people that even if you don't practice religion, religion is good for society. It's something that actually sort of holds us together.
Can you give me a concrete example of how religion is good for society?
So there's some examples that are sort of, I think, like obvious. There was a study that came out maybe 10 years ago, a book written by Arthur Brooks called "Who Really Cares?" That the prevailing wisdom is that people on the left care about their neighbor and care about um, people that are in poverty and economic justice and all that kind of stuff. And this book that he wrote actually examined the data. It's actually religious people that are motivated to give. So more philanthropy actually comes from religious people than from non-religious people. When churches and synagogues and mosques are serving their community, they are engaging in serving the homeless, serving the marginalized, in a way that's personal and can be holistic, versus a distant government bureaucrat who's merely putting a check into an envelope and putting it in the mail. Um, the being able to get help and be helped through an institution that values the whole person and doesn't merely send a check to cover material needs, is an avenue of help, an avenue of support that has a better chance at being able to remove a person from the circumstances that have caused whatever their difficulties may be. So beyond sort of like those pragmatic sort of ways that religion contributes to the common good or to the general welfare, there's no way to escape the fact that the West is a civilization that developed and emerged from people who are practicing the Christian faith. So even the idea of the individual and individual dignity is rooted in the Christian tradition. Paul Siedentop wrote the book Inventing the Individual that came out in the last 5 years, explicitly says the Apostle Paul invented the concept of the individual. Now, that doesn't mean that in other traditions you don't see this pop up. Islam has a view of the person that is in some ways similar, in some ways different from the Christian tradition. But the Christian tradition predates the emergence of that idea in Islam. And the fact that Western political discourse is focused, even in the most secular context, is focused on individual rights, is what Pierre Manat refers to as the fingerprints or the mark, Christian mark that we find in Western civilization. So as we attempt to undermine, the presence of religious influence in public life in the West, we ultimately are undermining the intellectual, philosophical underpinnings of those things that make the West so unique.
Well, I mean, and this is really one of the two truths of Christianity, right? That is deeply resonating on and rooted in the idea of God, right? That God is actually a person, or rather, he's one God in three persons, and there is relationship. So, I mean, that is fundamentally the basis of every true, right, political community. Is there is an individual and there is a relationship. There is a relationship to another individual. The relationship can only be between, well, two individuals. So yeah, very, very fascinating. Now, what I've seen in the history, actually, specifically of the West, and then in philosophy in particular, is that oftentimes all of what today is called kind of secular values, even they root historically in the Christian values that just have become kind of ontologically detached from God, from revelation, right, from a specific understanding of the divine. But it's questionable if they can actually remain in that vacuum, right? And I think that our kind of the culture war that we're in suggests that they're all under attack. These values are all under attack. So if we don't root them in that transcendent, in that ontological root that is the divine, then, well, eventually they'll just kind of dissipate. So
exactly, I think we're experiencing that for sure. Yeah.
Now you have a lot of a plethora of interesting projects, and with the center, you're obviously working in specifically that in producing and supporting and developing a culture that then is truly fit for the political, based on a religious viewpoint. Now, one of them that I find particularly interesting, so I want to ask you about it, is called Savannah Seminar. And given that there is a rich historical backdrop of Savannah as the British colonial capital of Georgia, is there, can you elaborate on the students and that unique setting, kind of learn from the religious experience that is kind of rooted in the history of that place? Is that why you chose the place in the first place?
Well, Savannah provides a lot of advantages for doing a program where we can link together both conceptually. So we spend the morning in a classroom with lectures from academics, and then experientially, where we use the city as a laboratory and we go out and we actually see different things that are emblematic of the things we've talked about in the morning. So Savannah, like you mentioned, was the colonial capital of Georgia, and it was established as a colony where only members of the Church of England could live. Within the first year, the first settlers encountered a crisis where they needed a doctor. So this motivated them to accept Jewish refugees from Portugal because among those refugees was a physician. And Georgia became actually the first place in North America where Jews could own property. Jews could own property in Georgia before Catholics could own property in Georgia. And so it wasn't long before you ended up with, sort of like these carve outs that accommodated religious differences and religious plurality. There's still a synagogue, a Jewish community in Savannah that traces themselves back to these Portuguese refugees who are coming from escaping from the Inquisition. Um, there's a Presbyterian church that's in downtown Savannah called the Independent Presbyterian Church that was founded by a group of settlers that were coming from Scotland who were given a land grant from King George II to build a building. They basically were given an exemption from being a member of the Church of England. And also, once you sort of have the confluence of people from different traditions that are there, and they're living side by side, they have to cooperate in order to be able to make their little society work. They started to build buildings that are uniquely um, representative of their own traditions.
Mhm.
So the Catholic Cathedral, for example, that's in Savannah, was built a little bit. I think it was built in the 1870s, but it was built by Irish immigrants who were coming to the United States at a point when there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiments. So they built a cathedral in a relatively backwater part of North America, in a place where Catholics were not in the majority. They didn't have any kind of social power, but they built this cathedral to sort of be maximally Catholic. It's a towering building. They built it as tall as they could, and they didn't build it according to sort of the trends of the day. It looks like a building that was built 100 years earlier, because they wanted it to reflect in every way what they viewed as sort of the best of the tradition. And so you've got an Episcopal church that's there, St. John's Episcopal Church, that in every way blends into to an Anglican city. Of course it's a regal church. You don't need to identify it as an Episcopal church. What other church could it possibly be? And so there's a church there that's one of, if it's not there's about 4 churches in America that claim to be the oldest continuously operating predominantly Black church. But there's a church called the First African Baptist Church as one of those 4. The building itself was built by the cooperation of both free and enslaved persons. So the religious life of Savannah from a very early date, even though it wasn't designed to be, was very pluralistic and very diverse. But all of these people cooperated together and ultimately were able to build a society that flourished and contributed in some very significant ways to American independence. And then Savannah ultimately became a very important port city. Um, and today you have families that can trace their heritage all the way back to the colonial and revolutionary period. And in their wisdom, the city did not bulldoze under their history like other cities that you would find that are that are old enough to have a colonial past. Unfortunately, Savannah is becoming a vacation destination, so you're starting to see some things that appeal to tourists and all that type of stuff. But by and large, Savannah has preserved its historic character, and so there's a sense of place, and a sense of pride that these families that are 6 and 7 and 8 generation Savannians um, can point to. But it's a great place for us to be able to start with the question: what exactly is it that religion contributes to building a society? And we can actually see the contribution of various groups and how they cooperated. It's an early experiment in pluralism, founded in 1733, and it has been, you can see more than 250 years later, um, a success story of what pluralism can do, pulling people together from diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds, building relationships of trust, and making their society work.
Does that trickle down to the students? Are they surprised to discover this about their own country fundamentally?
Yeah. I mean, we try to take a group of so the group of students that we have there every year, about 20. They're high performing. We try to bring them from around the country, and we intentionally pull together a an ecumenical group.
Mhm.
Uh, and unless you've got a student who is from a family with that immigration is in their recent past, a lot of them don't necessarily have like the same type of identity that's
Mhm.
been formed in a deep way by an awareness of what immigrants have meant to the U.S. I mean, and everyone except for Native Americans ultimately is an immigrant in some way to the U.S. And so you'll have Catholic students that are coming from Catholic universities where they're just immersed in, like, all of their peers are Catholic and all their professors are Catholic. And then they can see this cathedral, the story that I just told, and see, oh wow, there were these Catholic immigrants that came before us that had to struggle and they were marginalized, and they were excluded from, avenues of power, but they've built this beautiful place of worship here for us. And and other students are able to see sort of their own tradition, built. We actually, one year, we usually end with a Q&A, like, ask us anything. We'll have a panel of our speakers. And one of the students said, I've never been in a place before where people were this many different religious traditions present, but there's been this much unity. What is the key being able to cultivate that? Well, the key to cultivating that is to celebrate it, like we do when we're in Savannah, and point out the benefits that ultimately can come from that type of cooperation and mutual respect.
Very nice, very good. Well, good. Those are all of those students kind of clicking in their mind, right? They're all small success stories. So very nice.
Mhm.
Now, I have, as a philosopher, I am interested, obviously, in the principles and convictions. I have looked at the website that you have up, and so I found an old friend, I'd say, somebody that's dear to many members of my family, actually, whose books I've seen in the bookshelves of my mother and even my grandmother. That is Eric von Kuehnel-Leddihn. And now I know of his significant contributions to conservative thought, but I was kind of surprised to find him among the names on your website. So I'm just wondering, where does this come from? Where does the connection come from? Where did you find him, so to speak? And why do you think he's so underappreciated? And what do you do to change it?
Well, I have to confess that until 3 years ago, I had never heard the name. And I've been in the conservative sort of think tank world my entire career. And he didn't die until 1999. Like, his life and my life overlapped. It's not like this is a distant figure from the past.
Yeah.
But we have our flagship student program is a 10-week fellowship where talented undergraduate students who are thinking about graduate programs come to our offices, and they research a topic and write a paper, and we provide them with mentorship, editorial assistance, and we try to help them to put together something that's going to be a publishable quality work. And one of these students came. His name is Cooper Adamo. He actually studies aerospace engineering at the University of Oklahoma. He doesn't actually study philosophy, oddly enough.
Very
And
nice.
he did a research project on Eric von Canela. And since that time, I've read a couple of his books, a couple of his articles. I was shocked to find out that, because my thought was, oh well, this is another academic who's made these contributions to a niche, and of course I've not heard of it. But he was an original contributor to National Review. Like, he's written for all types of audiences. I think that one of the things that's interesting about him is that he he's got this quote. He's got this fantastic quote that is, the average person thinks that it's something like this. The average person believes that all of our problems are traceable to World War II. The more informed believe that they're traceable to World War I. But for the true historian, they know that it roots back to the French Revolution.
Mhm.
And, he has this broad perspective of, the modern history of Western civilization that crosses um, I think he spoke like 14 different languages or something like that. So he could bring together thinking from Eastern Europe and from Western Europe and from the Anglosphere, uh, crossover cultures, crossover time. And so he's just this highly integrative thinker that can put the whole picture together. And I think that some of his concerns about democracy are um, are playing out, in our time. His concern with democracy was that that ultimately the mob rule or rule by the majority could ultimately result in sort of a coerced. I mean, he talks about having a problem with egalitarianism, and it's very unpopular to be able to say, "Oh, I don't believe in equality," right? Is especially rich coming from a man that's a member of a noble family saying, I don't believe in equality. But that's not exactly, I mean, it wasn't equality in the sense of, like our equal dignity as image bearers of God or something like that. But there's a natural uniqueness to every person. And his concern was that this natural uniqueness was something that could be repressed coercively by a majoritarian rule. He pointed out Hitler and Stalin, or Hitler and Lenin both came to power through democratic means, and so he talked about democratic tyranny, or democratic totalitarianism, I think is the term that he used. And so it would, I'm glad that we've discovered him. I mean, there are other more accessible sources: Tocqueville, Scruton, Russell Kirk. He himself was a Tocqueville scholar. He was friends with Scruton. He was friends with Russell Kirk. Um, but it's perplexing to me why he's so underappreciated. I don't know what the answer is to that mystery.
Not coming from or just kind of dabbling in the academic world, but I can tell you that's the treasure chest, right? As an academic, you want to find something that is not yet exhausted. So if you find somebody that can, kind of dig deep there, then I think you'll make an academic very happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good. Now, one more question in regards to religion. I just want to come back to that, because we did talk about egalitarianism now. So, how do you kind of steer the difficult waters of working with different religions, but not being relativistic, like not being well, that the relation of different religions can be very difficult. So, what gives the unity of different religion? Does it have to be government? Does it ultimately have to play out in the individual kind of field, so that every religion is supposed to coexist with the other? What about religions that do not want to coexist with other religions? So, how would you tackle that?
Well, I think that one of the best examples or discussions of this actually comes from an American rabbi, Joseph Soloveitchik, who immigrated post World War II. Mm-hmm. And the problem with the Jewish refugee population was facing in the U.S. is that they were tempted to sort of abandon their distinctiveness and sort of, um, uh, just sort of disappear into the mass of the American melting pot, or when there were ecumenical conversations about how these Jewish groups could contribute, there was a fear of talking about differences It was only like, what do we have in common that was at the table? So in 1964, he gave a talk called Confrontation to a gathering of American Orthodox rabbis, where he laid out, what we really need to do in order to be able to make a contribution here and to engage in ecumenical cooperation for, common purposes, is to confront our differences. And at the very beginning of the conversation, before we ever talk about what we have in common, we need to talk about what it is that sets Judaism apart from Christianity, apart from Islam, apart from secular humanism. And only at the point where we can figure out where the borders are, for our particular tradition, can we find ways that we're able to cooperate in ways that don't offend the consciences of various groups. And so various groups may have to opt in or opt out of different ways of cooperating together. But I think that that's the way forward with both ecumenical, so like internal to Christianity, internal cooperation, but then also interfaith cooperation. Now, Hermann, who is another sort of European philosopher that's a hero of the CRCD's like perspective on the world, wrote a pretty controversial book in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo massacres, a handful of terror attacks that happened in France right after that, called Beyond Radical Secularism. And he tackles this of like, how do you deal with a group that might not want to coexist? And he's actually talking about Islamists here. And and I think that he's right when he says you just simply can't tolerate it. That we've made a mistake in the West in sprinting so quickly toward having a plural, open, welcoming society that we've never stopped to say these are the expectations of citizens, the responsibilities. So this I think is actually rooted in a misinterpretation of the way that we think of what a right is. We oftentimes act like a right is something you assert against somebody. We never actually take into consideration that with rights comes responsibilities. A right that's recognized by the state produces a duty on other that imposes some sort of action or restraint on others in society. And so we just pass out rights like candy and never take into consideration the way that those rights ultimately impact the shape of our communities. And he handles quite well the question of what do you do, with the immigrant family that doesn't want to send their daughters to school. And he says, well, the answer to that is once you enter into the West, you become a Western citizen or a French citizen in the case that, that he's actually specifically writing about. And there is a right, whether, philosophically, there's or jurisprudentially, there's obviously, I'm being a little bit sloppy here, but a French citizen is entitled to an education. And so there's not a way to abrogate that entitlement. And so there's a certain agreement that everyone who's going to be a part of Western civilization, a Western society, has to agree with. Everybody, in order to be able to have a thriving multicultural society, everyone gives up a little bit for the sake of the whole. Everyone sacrifices something for the sake of the whole. And this is one of the benefits of having, this is one of the reasons why religious freedom is so important, because we do have a secular public square, but everyone has to be able to have the vehicle to come into the public square fully, completely, in an uncensored way, with the freedom to express who they are, where they get their moral values, what those moral values are, because that's the only way that we can actually have productive political discourse. You can't be hiding a part of who you are. You have to be able to come into the public square and be able to be fully honest, or else we have sort of a veneer of unity that's not actually durable, not actually sustainable. And so, it is going to require, some difficult, unpopular, politically incorrect approaches, I think, to dealing with those who would not want to be constructive members of society. But unless we're willing to do those things, a plural society like we see in the West is simply not sustainable.
Yeah, it's a great thought. Also, what he said earlier, citing the rabbi, this idea that the collaboration really starts where I affirm my difference, right? Where I affirm the limit, basically, of what I'm willing to do. But that's where that honesty comes in that you just mentioned, is that I have to know myself, I have to know my own identity. But knowing one's own identity also means knowing both one's strengths and one's weaknesses. And in the weakness, right, in the knowing of the weakness, that's where the other can come in. And that's where you ask yourself, well, is it maybe better if my daughter actually goes to school and learns certain things? Is it better for her, right? Is it better? That may be my weakness, my conviction, but then I can be enriched from that. So very good.
Yeah.
Well, Trey, thank you very much for this conversation. It's a really fantastic work that you're doing. So I wish you all the best with the center, and I'm sure that we'll encounter each other again. So thank you for being on the show, and thank you for your time. And I'll speak to you next time.